Are you not positioning the Western secular against the Islamic secular in a way where you don't really end up moving away from the religious secular dichotomy so much as shift the epistemic contours?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I'm not sure how you can say that. If what I'm saying is that the religious encompasses the secular in the Islamic secular. So there is no dichotomy in that sense. But in the Western secular, the secular is not religious. That's the whole point.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Wael Hallaq, editor-in-chief of Muftah magazine, and I'm joined for this episode by my co-host and Muftah senior editor, Ahmed al-Binni. On December the 27th, we spoke with Sherman Jackson, a theorist of religion who works at the intersections of Islam, law, and race. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1990 and is currently Distinguished Professor of Islamic Thought, as well as Professor of Religion and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He is the author of many works, including his 2002 book On the Boundaries of Theological Tolerance in Islam, his 2005 book Islam and the Black American, and his 2009 book Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. We invited Professor Jackson onto the podcast to discuss his new book, The Islamic Secular. Jackson's central claim in the book is that Islam has its own version of the secular, distinct from other common understandings and applications in both Western scholarly and quotidian discourses. Some Western theorists of religion and the secular have claimed that secularity constitutes and manages what we often call religion. By contrast, however, Professor Jackson argues that the Islamic secular is, by definition, a religious secular, insofar as a certain God consciousness always regulates it. His book represents an attempt to theorize this form of the secular in conversation with a range of recent works in Islamic studies, philosophy, religious studies, anthropology, and political theory. Our conversation with Professor Jackson focused mostly on the theoretical foundation of his argument as we pushed him to explain the meaning, coherence, and tenability of a so-called religious secular. We also discussed how his views compare and contrast with those of other theorists wrestling with similar questions, including Rushain Abbasi, Wael Hallaq, Shahab Ahmad, and others. We hope you'll enjoy the episode as much as we did making it, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions at proteanview@muftah.org. If you like this episode and would like to support our work, please consider subscribing and donating. You can find more information by visiting us at muftah.org/protean-view or by navigating to the donate and join links on our homepage. Thanks for listening. This is Protean View. Professor Jackson, thanks very much for agreeing to the interview. I want to jump into some of the more technical details of your book, but I think for the sake of our listeners, we should start with a broad overview. If you could you tell us a little bit about what the Islamic secular is about? What's your main argument? And is the Islamic secular, in your view, an entirely novel concept, or is there a precedent to be found in pre-modern Islamic tradition?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with your intellectual capital on a book that, as I mentioned in the book itself, is intended to be the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. I think that in broad outline, and I think we have to keep in mind the book is over 500 pages long, so a very broad outline means a very broad outline. But basically, I mean, the modern world is essentially divided into two sort of spheres. There is the secular and there is the religious. And I think that sort of dichotomy comes out of the history of Europe and the experience of religion in Europe and how the West decided to handle sort of the problem of religion, namely by carving out spaces or spheres where religion would exercise no authority. And so you have certain spheres, I mean, the big ones being economics, politics, and science, where basically religion is sort of sequestered or cordoned off. And that was for the purpose of freeing our society from religion and being able to pursue matters in these areas unimpeded by the kinds of strictures and restrictions that religion might impose. And so that was the whole idea of the secular. Now, of course, as this comes to Islam through the agency of forces of the modern world, the assumption is that this can sort of unproblematically be superimposed. And when I say superimposed, I don't mean politically. I just mean ideologically even. In other words, that the same schema, the same interpretive prism through which we read and analyze and understand the West will be applicable to Islam. And then, of course, as we all know, Muslims internalize all kinds of aspects of the interpretive prism that was sort of brought to them and applied to them by the West. And so you have potentially the same idea percolating in Islam, that there is a secular and then there is a religious sphere. The Islamic secular is designed to challenge the notion that the secular and the religious are necessarily dichotomous, that one can either be secular or religious, but one cannot be secular and religious at the same time. Or an issue can be either secular or religious, but there's no way of bringing a sort of quote-unquote secular and a religious perspective to bear on that issue at the same time. Now, the idea itself is not entirely novel. And let me just say a word about how I sort of came to this, and then I'll try to briefly cut this off because I can tell we're already sort of going longer than I had hoped we would go. But it's not an entirely novel idea. Going back 30 years when I was writing my dissertation on Shahab al-Qarafi, one of the things that really jumped out at me was the fact that he was very comfortable. In fact, not only comfortable, he insisted on the necessity and the importance of maintaining the boundaries of what Sharia could be legitimately called upon to tell us and what it could not. And basically, you might, it's more sophisticated than this, but you might want to divide it into issues of law versus issues of fact. And so, for example, to give a very simple example, what is the time for the noon prayer? All right. Or how many times a day does a Muslim have to pray? What al-Qarafi would argue is that, well, we know about the obligation to pray from the Quran, from the Sunnah. We know about the times to pray from the Sunnah of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, for example, the Prophet's teaching instructs us that, when the sun declines from its meridian to a certain degree, that marks the beginning of the time for the noon prayer. What al-Qarafi would say is that a jurist can tell us what the time for the noon prayer is. But the fact of the sun declining from its meridian to a certain degree, that is a question of fact. And one need not be trained in the law to be able to determine that fact. And so what you have is a distinction between jurisdiction of law and jurisdiction of fact. And what al-Qarafi is concerned about is these two jurisdictions being confused, whereby those who have training in law sometimes will set themselves up to make determinations of fact on which they are not trained. Now, of course, the example of the sun in the sky is a very simple one. Anybody can look in the sky and, see that. But when you get to more sophisticated, complicated issues, economics, science, this, that, and the other, al-Qarafi is very keen on maintaining the distinction between what can be gained from the interpretation of scripture or the sources of Sharia and what is a matter of empirical observation, etc. And so that sort of alerted me to the idea of boundaries, not in the sense of the secularization of Islam, where religion is sort of shrunk and limited to a particular sphere, but in the sense of knowing what it is that Sharia can be properly called upon to tell us, i.e., the time on the noon prayer, and what it cannot. Where is the sun in the sky? All right? The second major indication for me was the juristic discussion on the hukm shara'i. When you read usul fiqh books, there's this discussion on al-hukm, i.e. hukm shara'i. And what we find there is that, particularly in the post-formative period, jurists are very explicit in distinguishing what they call the shara'i, and they're very quite clear on the fact that the shara'i is that knowledge of which we gain from the sources of Sharia, Quran, Sunnah, etc. And then you have the non-shara'i, and which some will call the aqli, which is not based on the Quran and Sunnah. And again, they insist that the two jurisdictions should not be confused. So grammar, philosophy, medicine, these are non-Shari'i pursuits. And we cannot rely on the sources of Sharia to learn the details, the concrete substance of these disciplines. And so here we come to the third pillar, which is a distinction, even in the Western discussion of the secular, between what I call in the book, the macro secular, which is, what we generally understand the secular to be, which is non-religious. It's Weber's, disenchantment of the world, whereby we simply lose our religious sensibilities and we are no longer connected to the transcendent. And so life is all imminent. That's one mode of the secular. The other mode is what they call differentiation. And here, the transcendent is still there, but certain areas of concern are differentiated in that even if we still believe in God in general, even if we still believe in the Bible in general, the Bible, and by the way, this is not the doing of the theologians per se. This was the architects of the modern secular narrative who decided certain issues would be cordoned off. Certain issues would be issues to which the Bible would not be understood to speak. And so we retain religion in the general sense, but it does not apply to certain spheres. Now, for me, the theory of differentiation dovetails with the distinction that the jurists make between the Shari'i and the non-Shari'i, i.e. the Shari'i being that we can learn from the sources of Sharia, the non-Shari'i being that we do not. The difference, however, is that in the West, that cordon off zone, the secular zone, was a non-religious zone. It was a zone in which basically religion stayed out. All right? My thesis is that there is no such zone as that in Islam. And so the adjudicative gaze of the God of Islam, the watchful gaze of the God of Islam, the idea that I am responsible for what I do and think is ubiquitous. It has no limits. And so even when I'm operating in the non-Shari'i realm, I'm still operating under the conscious awareness of the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. And in that sense, my quote-unquote secular, non-Shari'i, differentiated, what I call micro-secular actions are still religious. And that's where we come up with the Islamic secular.
I want to follow up on the distinction you made between fact and law, but before I do that, I just want to quickly ask for clarification just so that our audience understands. Your use of the term secular has nothing to do with secularism as we often use it in the Western context. Essentially, what we're dealing with here is a homonym, correct?
Well, if you want to call it a homonym, okay. Yes, it has nothing to do with secular as non-religious, and certainly not contra-religious. So what some people may want to ask, and I address this issue in the book, then why use the term at all?
Right.
Right? Then why use the term at all? Right. Well, because two reasons. One, first, that there is this notion afoot that the Western secular is the only secular, that the history of the West can be universalized and therefore applied to every other civilization, such that the meanings that emerge out of the West are applicable everywhere. So what the secular means in the West, it means everywhere. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, as Muslims, we subscribe to the view that the watchful gaze of the God of Islam is ubiquitous. That there's nothing that I can do that is beyond the scope of God's gaze. And in that sense, religion is ubiquitous. It's totalizing. It's with me everywhere I go. The recording angels are at work with regard to everything that I do. But here the question becomes, okay, if religion in that broad sense has universal scope, does that mean, therefore, that everything that I do, even in pursuit of the instantiation of Islam on the ground, is everything I do derived directly from Scripture? And here's where we go back to the distinction that the jurists make between the shari'i, i.e. that which is derived from scripture, and the non-shari'i, or the aqli, which is not. So medicine, for example, at least aspects of medicine, and there are no sort of ironclad boundaries here. I don't mean to imply that. But aspects of medicine, or physics, or economics, certainly modern economics, financial planning, those would be issues in terms of the concrete substance or form for which we would not be relying on the Quran, but on our own knowledge of economics or medicine or whatever the discipline may happen to be. And yet, we remain under the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. And in that way, Muslims are not divided between a quote-unquote religious and a secular existence as they are in the West. The whole idea of separating, church from state was that, well, if you don't, then every aspect of the political realm will be determined on the basis of scripture. Well, the Islamic Secular says, well, no, not necessarily. There may be aspects of the political order. So, for example, you take many of the political offices that emerge in Islam. Chamberlains and this wazir and this exchequer and, all the kinds of offices that develop. They're clearly not coming from scripture itself. Some of these offices even have non-Arabic names, atabeg and all these kinds of things. And so if you think about an issue like, let's take a modern issue, term limits. On what basis would we decide term limits? And what if assuming that Muslims adopt a modern democratic order, what would be the age of voting? And how would that be derived from scripture? And so you have a non-shari'i issue being deliberated on the basis of non-shari'i act, but an act that is still under the conscious awareness of the gaze of the God of Islam. It's a religious secular, oxymoron as it may be.
I have a longer question to ask about that, but I'm going to let Ahmad jump in. I think you have a briefer question to ask, and then I'll come back to mine.
Right. So, Professor Jackson, my question is, what motivates your definition of the Islamic secular as a psycho-spiritual orientation characterized specifically by taqwa, qurba, obeisance? I mean, obviously the notions of taqwa and qurba, they're indigenous to the pre-modern Islamic tradition. But you bringing them together in this context and theorizing them systematically as the key constituents of the notion of the Islamic secular, would you say that's your own innovation?
No, I to be honest with you, and I'm sure that there will be people. I mean, some who agree and some who don't agree. I mean, again, I see my work primarily as one of excavation in a sense. Yes, I'm the synthesizer. I will acknowledge that. But the individual tropes are coming from Islamic tradition itself. If you go, I think it's either in the introduction or in chapter 1. I think it's in chapter 1. There's a quote in there from none other than Ibn Taymiyyah. And by the way, when I say none other than Ibn Taymiyyah, all I mean by that is that, Ibn Taymiyyah is known for, a lot of things. Being soft on religion is not one. Being inclined toward the secular in the modern Western sense is not one, right? And he says very explicitly that there is no way that the Quran could address, or the Quran and Sunnah could address every single solitary action that you must engage in on a daily basis and do that for everyone. It's going to lay down parameters. It's going to impart values. It's going to impart virtues and sensibilities. And then in terms of the concrete circumstances with which you are confronted, you have to decide how to act. And in so doing, Ibn Taymiyyah says, this is why we have been commanded to seek that guidance from God. Even where, in other words, from God directly, not from Scripture, because Scripture is not going to tell me what to buy my wife for her birthday. What should I buy? All right, Scripture is not going to tell me that. And so I turn to God for guidance in that regard. That's the concept of obeisance. And the Islamic secular does not work without that. because then it simply becomes another sort of version of the Western secular, where God disappears.
Okay, this is a good point for me to ask the question I wanted to ask. So I understand how your notion of the Islamic secular aims to move away from the dichotomy between the religious and the secular as it's formulated in Western discourses. But I sometimes struggle to see how it's accomplished. For example, in the book you cite Talal Asad, among others, to claim that the folly of the religious-secular divide in Western discourse is that it obscures how the secular co-constitutes the religious by regulating it, or in other words, how the secular is sort of the central node of the Western secular. And by contrast, you say the Islamic secular is different because the religious is its anchoring force. And in that sense, Islam's secular is still a religious secular. But I think in saying this, and I'd be curious to see how you might respond here. Are you not positioning the Western secular against the Islamic secular in a way where you don't really end up moving away from the religious secular dichotomy so much as shift the epistemic contours? Because the distinction between the Islamic secular and the Western secular in a broader meta sense here is now one between the religious domain in the sense of the Islamic secular and the secular domain in the sense of the Western secular.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I'm not sure how you can say that. If what I'm saying is that the religious encompasses the secular in the Islamic secular. Okay, so so there is no dichotomy in that sense. There's a dichotomy between the Shari'i, i.e., as that which can be derived directly from scripture or even by analogy, and the non-Shari'i, which cannot.
Right. But my question is, when you think about those two divisions in the Islamic secular as opposed to the two divisions in the Western secular.
But in the Western secular, the secular is not religious. That's the whole point of a secular. That's not the point of the Islamic secular. Now, if you're saying that, well, to have a secular versus a religious secular, you're still dealing with a secular, and there's no real distinction. There's no real advantages of one to the other. I would respectfully, fundamentally disagree with that.
I wouldn't go so far as to say there's no utility or usefulness, or that it's not a productive distinction to make. Not at all. But what I would say is that, precisely as you just put it, there's the secular, and then there's the religious secular, and seeing them as opposed to one another, in fact, articulating the Islamic secular against the Western secular in that way, is to, in a sense, reify the very distinction that you set out to oppose.
Not at all. It's only reified if we do what a number of people have done in reading the book, if we are unable to transcend the incumbents of the Western secular as the touchstone. That's the point of departure of everyone. And everything else is compared with that. As opposed to saying, okay, the Western has its secular, and that operates out of its own history, its universal values and meanings, etc. And Islam has it. And the Islamic secular, is a separate entity. It comes out of its own civilization. It comes out of its own universe of values and meanings. All right? The theorists on whom I draw are jurists, writers of usul fiqh. I mean, these are not pre-modern, by the way. I mean, these are not people who have any interest in sequestering religion. All right, and they're very explicit about some of these things, as you'll see in the book.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to push this. Much longer.
I think if I might be to read a little something into your question based on some conversations I've with others, I think that the complaint is that we're still comparing ourselves with the West, and in so doing, we are still empowering the West as the touchstone, as the standard, as the model against which everything else has to be compared. All right.
Right. And then on top, if I may just quickly interject, it's not just that. It's also that it seems to me difficult to conceptualize the Islamic secular, even though I understand your point. And in fact, I agree with what you're saying about the need to think about language beyond the contours of what sort of our current discourses say the secular must mean. But at the same time, it seems to me very difficult, if not impossible, to conceive of the Islamic secular, if not against the Western secular. And in that regard, it's almost indelibly tethered to it.
No, I would disagree. But let me go back to the point that I was just making first. All right. I mean, look, I think that there is this I don't know, desire, or you want to call it desire or obsession or something. But I mean, the idea that there is some Archimedean point for which anyone can speak, that we can somehow get out of, I don't know, the world and view things from a position of nowhere and everywhere, and from that position of nowhere and therefore everywhere, craft an Islamic vision that is supposed to be purely Islamic now, untainted by any of the devolutions, that come from the Western hegemony in the world. I don't understand that impulse. I don't understand that obsession, because it's not real. There is no Archimedean point. And I think that what we must understand is that there's a difference between the West being an interlocutor. And I think that if you're living in a world where a particular civilization has become dominant, has become ascendant, just like Islam was, all right, prior to modernity, okay? Then, if you're speaking on the global stage, then you are in conversation with that ascending civilization. And yet, that ascending civilization does not have to be the dictator of all that you think, of all that you value.
I agree with that.
The Prophet himself had to be in conversation with the pagan Arabians. Had to be. And yet, he was able to change some of the meanings, change some of the associations through some of the same language. So he stays in conversation with that. But that is not the dictator of the values and meanings that he promotes. And I think that if you're not in conversation, then you run the risk of staying on your Archimedean point, or at your Archimedean point. You're speaking from nowhere and everywhere, and therefore to no one.
I think we're actually closer to agreement than disagreement here. We can.
What's our disagreement? Let me understand. What's our disagreement?
I still think that the choice to articulate the Islamic secular in the way that you did in the introduction of the book, as against the Western secular, is a testament to the fact.
When we say against, am I trying to defeat the Western secular? No. Okay. I said the Western secular, all right, is its own secular, and it is what it is. I'm not here to refute it. I say that very explicitly in the book. I'm saying, however, that Western secular concept cannot be legitimately superimposed onto Islam, as it has not only by non-Muslims, but by Muslims themselves. And so you have this situation where Muslims feel that they're only acting religiously, all right, when they're praying and fasting. And anytime they go into the lab, well, this is no longer religious. To whose advantage is that? Certainly not Islam's. So if you go back, like you said, to the introduction, when somebody like Sinan al-Ma'amari, the great Ottoman architect, when he's doing his craft, do we really think that the watchful gaze of the God of Islam is not informing what he's doing? Although he's not calling on the Quran or the Sunnah for the technical details of his technique or his craft.
That's not quite where my disagreement lies, but I think we've pursued this as far as we can. Perhaps we can revisit some of this later, but I'm going to turn it over to Ahmed for now.
Well, Professor Jackson, I think there have been some other recent efforts to theorize something like an Islamic secular, most prominently, for example, with someone like Rushain Abbasi. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see your approach differing from, for on the one hand, someone like Abbasi, And on the other hand, the project for the Islamization of knowledge.
Well, okay. I think that for Professor Abbasi, and let me just say this. I mean, I think that he's a really bright upcoming scholar. I think that there's nothing but positive things to expect from his output moving forward. And so I disagree with Professor Abbasi, but I don't do so from some perch of that seeks to denigrate or devalue his work. I simply disagree with it. All right, and that's not to negate the possible value of it. I think
what is the nature of your disagreement with him precisely?
I think the disagreement, the fundamental disagreement that we have, if I understand him correctly, and I'm sure if I don't, I will be made to understand him correctly later in January when I go up to Stanford and talk about the book. Our fundamental disagreement is that he tends to hold the dunya, the secular, as a non-religious space in Islam. I do not see dunya or secular, non-shari, as a non-religious space in Islam. That is the fundamental disagreement that Professor Abbasi and I have. With regard to the Islamization of knowledge, look, on some level, there is some overlap. In as much as Islamization of knowledge proponents would talk about things like Islamic culture, for example. All right. Well, I would also insist on the importance of an quote unquote Islamic culture. All right. So there's that sort of overlap. I think where we fundamentally differ, however, is that my understanding of the Islamic may be what you might want to call a little more passive. I'm not sure that's the exact word I want to use, but let me try and explain what I mean by that. If I'm operating in the arena of the mubah, of the permissible within Islam, all right, and I'm doing so with obeisance, okay, fully aware of the watchful gaze of the God of Islam, while I'm also trying to turn my efforts to some kind of benefit, all right, Islamically speaking, either for myself or for my community, all right, then what the result of that action will be Islamic, all right? The Islamization of knowledge proponents, on my understanding at least, seem to have a more active sense of the Islamic. In other words, they decide what the parameters of an Islamic is, substantively speaking, all right, and then try to get everything to fit that, all right, and so they would have a preconceived understanding of what an Islamic X, Y, or Z would be, and try to ensure that everything conformed to that. On the Islamic secular, there's no preconceived. All right, something that is not Islamic today could be Islamic tomorrow, according to the Islamic secular. And it might not even come from, originally at least, it might not even come from Muslims. As many things in the past did not.
Yes, and that's actually, I think, a perfect place for me to ask this question. So you place significant emphasis, right, on intention, right, as an Islamizing agent, so to speak. Specifically, on the Islamic eligibility of any action that's undertaken as a sincere expression of God consciousness, correct? But you're not saying that any Muslim's good faith attempt to seek divine pleasure is Islamic, right? You're careful to clarify that Islam is not just what observant Muslims do.
That's right.
So as I read you then, to avoid reducing Islam to this purely interiorized, Protestant-like religiosity that overemphasizes individual conscience at the expense of scriptural commandments, you introduce this idea of the community as a sort of a normative guardrail So I'm going to read here from the book. You give this example. The company that makes Barbie dolls might introduce a model with a hijab in recognition of Muslim sensibilities or markets, but such a doll will only become a quote-unquote Islamic doll through a validation brought about by its acceptance and popularity among Muslims. So the Islamic secular, as an orientation, it could produce many ideas or actions that are provisionally Islamic in terms of their intention, but
in terms of their intention and their utility.
But, quote, through a process of communal sifting, debate, practical consideration, and collective mood, they might eventually, quote, fail to gain communal acceptance as normative expressions of Islam. So my question there is, how are you defining the community here, right? Like what and where is this community that is going to undertake this process? Did you talk about the ummah?
No.
Right?
Well, no. I mean, when I say, are you serious? I mean, because we know that. Well, let me put it this way: as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, there are no what they would call jami'a, mania definitions of community. I mean, that would neither be over-inclusive or under-inclusive. All right. So if you're asking me for a definition of community, all right.
No. Well, specifically on.
Okay.
But how is this specific?
Having said that much, I think, quite frankly, here, we'd probably be better off operating on a sort of common sense understanding of community, and rather than focusing on the definition, focus on the function. So what I'm saying is that it, and again, I hope you took that quote in the broader context, because we're not talking about, Islam as an abstract ideal. We're talking
as a lived reality.
Enunciation of Islam on the ground.
Yes.
And what I'm saying there is that community is the ultimate arbiter. Now, how do we define that community? I mean, in America, let's say, well, what is the Muslim community? Is the Black American contingent distinct from the Arab contingent? Is the Arab contingent then distinct from the South Asian contingent? All right. So we have community, and we have subcommunity, and we have subcommunity. All right. And there will be entities that will work in some of those subcommunities that they will redefine, and they will, what's the word I'm looking for? They will sanction as Islamic. This is the norm that we will follow in this community. And those who do not follow this norm, they will be viewed in a certain way. Outside that community, however, or that sub-community, you'd have a different norm. But still, the community be the ultimate arbiters.
So practically, you're referring to a great variety of culturally and historically situated Muslim communities. Each of which
and I think that I mean, look, wait. I mean, is spicy food an Islamic norm? You see, that's what I'm saying. So it is that community in that location that says we want our people to enjoy their meal. They like spicy food, all right? It is normative then, Islamically, to have spicy food here. Now, of course, we run into problems in that sometimes you don't recognize that that's a subsection of the community. And there are other communities for whom that is not the case. All right? But even there, it is the community that is the ultimate sort of arbiter.
Right. And so you're not invoking anything as formal as ijma', for example.
No, I mean, nothing you have.
Yeah.
No. And by the way, and I want to say this very clearly. I mean, when we use the word community, we generally get this warm, for the sort of fuzzy feeling, that these are, as the young people say, these are my peeps. All right. I mean, these are the people with whom my sensibilities, my fears and my memories resonate. And I think that is certainly clear on one level, but on another level, there are potential liabilities in communities. All right, communities can become overly authoritarian. They can become overly rigid. They can become paranoid in terms of their willingness or ability to entertain new possibilities that may be just as effective as the old ones, but simply different. And so community is sort of like marriage. I mean, marriage is lovely, but it still has to be managed. And there are lots of negotiations and deliberations that have to take place within a marriage in order for it to work. The same thing with regard to community. And I think if I might just go off tangent just for a minute here, and I think that one of the problems we have now is that somehow the civics that would enable us to engage in those kinds of deliberations have broken down to the point that we can't have those deliberations. And what we end up with is, a lot of hurt feelings on the one hand, mutual snubbing on the other.
Right.
And in fact, this is part of what the Islamic secular part is meant to mediate. All right? Because oftentimes, whether we have spicy food or not, all right, is not a hukm shari. Spicy food is halal. Non-spicy food is halal. We're dealing with a non-shari, all right, Islamic secular, if I can say that now, preference, all right? How do we deliberate that? Well, we certainly don't do so by saying that those people who want spicy food, all right, are violating some hukm shari. Or those people who don't want spicy food are violating some hukm shari. They're committing an offense against God, all right? Which is the way that we usually sort of try to manage these disputes. I mean, that's the way we terminate the dispute, all right? We determine who's the bad Muslim and who's the good Muslim. The good Muslim wins, the bad Muslim loses. But there are no good Muslim, bad Muslim between spicy and non-spicy food. And the Islamic secular, all right, is designed to highlight the fact that this is a non-shari issue that we're debating here. The hukm shari is clear, mubah. Spicy, non-spicy, mubah. Now the question becomes, which one of those best serve, all right, the immediate interest of the community before us?
Right. And of course, the stakes become higher as you move up to questions of governance, for instance.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Do you have a sense of
this is going to be one of the major challenges. And I think that, traditionally, the way that we try to handle this is to sort of push everything back into the Shari'i realm, all right, where we can have, very explicit ahkam that say who's right and who's wrong, all right? And then we have to worry about, number one, okay, those solutions not working, all right, because they're not sufficiently sort of contemplated on the basis upon which they should be contemplated, all right? And number two, we have to worry about them occupying, okay? No arrangement that we come up with today in terms of particulars, just like in your house, no arrangement that we come up with today is guaranteed to work 50 years from now. And if we've said that, no, this is the transcendent Sharia, then what do we do 50 years from now? The Islamic secular enables us to disaggregate these things into Shari'i and non-Shari'i elements. Recognize the transcendence of this and the negotiable nature of that, whereby in 50 years, we can make certain adjustments without either relying upon Sharia or offending Sharia.
If I could just ask a follow-up question to that. And as you say, the problem is that we don't have mechanisms for this sort of deliberation. And would you say it's sort of a meta problem where the mechanisms for deliberation are themselves in the realm of what you would call the Islamic secular?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's needed to negotiate the Islamic secular. So in which case, how would you go about establishing those mechanisms for deliberation?
Well, I can't answer that. I can't answer that question. But what I will say is that I can be a contributor to the conversation that arrives at what we should do. All right. But again, the answer to that would not come from some verse in the Quran or some hadith from the Prophet, and therefore it is one of those issues. All right. وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. It is one of those issues that communities must deliberate. And I don't want to put too much of an emphasis on this, but part of what I hope, one of the advantages of the Islamic secular is, if we understand it as Islamic secular, is that it enables us to debate these issues without accusing each other of being more or less committed to what Allah and His Messenger have said. because that's where the sort of mutual snubbing, the depletion of trust between Muslims, if 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 every time you and I get into a dispute, I'm made to feel that you're questioning my religiosity, my commitment to what Allah and His Messenger have said, well, it's not going to be very long before I simply drop out. And I think that that's what we have pretty much across the board, in large segments of the Muslim community.
Well, in the course of our conversation just now, a few minutes ago, the word normative came up, and I did want to ask about that. So, as I read you, as far as the Islamic Secular is concerned, you reject the existence of any non-religious, non-normative realm, correct?
How is that?
Well, the Islamic Secular does not recognize a non-religious, non-normative realm.
Yeah, but you see, again, what do you mean by religious?
Right. Well, again, conventionally understood. I mean,
no, we can't go back conventional on that. If we're dealing with the Islamic Secular, look, I don't see where I reject any non-normative.
Sorry. Did I say non-religious? I'm sorry. I meant to say sorry. The existence of any religious non-normative. Sorry, I misphrased that question. Right, not non-religious, non-normative. Right. You reject the Islamic Secular does not recognize a non-normative realm that is outside the Islamic.
No, that's no. That's not what the Islamic Secular is doing. When you say non-normative, I mean, look, the mubah, all right, imposes no obligation. All right, so I'm not sure that we can speak of the mubah in terms of its being normative. All right, it is. I'm going to make up a word here. It is permissive. All right, but normative. It does not say that this is preferred to that. In fact, it says there is no preference between this and that. All right. What the Islamic Secular is saying, however, is this: that although there may be no Shari'i preference, all right, between this particular investment strategy and that particular investment strategy, and that both of them may be deemed permissible, mubah. That assessment alone, however, will not be enough to provide us with what we need to instantiate a healthy Islam on the ground. We need some other criterion on the basis of which we determine which of these is a good investment strategy, a profitable investment strategy, a sustainable investment strategy, and which is not. That's not an abandonment of anything normative. It's just saying that the normativity here does not come from Sharia. It comes from the profitability, sustainability, long-term durability of that investment strategy. And we have to be able to engage in those kinds of assessments in order to properly instantiate Islam on the ground. If all we're left with is this is permissible, well, then there are 1,000 different permissible strategies. As a community, how do we then say, okay, we have the permission, all right? We have the permission for all of these. Now, how do you deliberate in terms of what we should do?
So, yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand how you are defining normative, because it seems to me that in the book, you make clear again that, for example, the Islamic Secular is not only concerned with truth or meaning. That's part of your critique of Shahab Ahmad, right? That he seems to ultimately restrict Muslims to devotional acts by defining Islam in terms of meaning making through hermeneutical engagement,
or morality, for that matter.
Yeah. In that case, though, can you say that Muslims, when acting non-normatively, can be acting Islamically?
Wait a minute. What do you mean non-normatively?
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. I'm trying to understand what for you are the boundaries of normativity, right? If it's not just
no. See, okay, Ahmed.
Yes.
These are excellent questions, and I'm glad you're insisting on on forcing me to get the question. All right, but let me try to reiterate the point that I'm trying to make. The Islamic Secular recognizes two realms, all right, of religiosity, a Shari'i and a non-Shari'i realm.
Yes.
If you're speaking of normativity on the Shari'i realm, then that is what we should do, or maybe perhaps must do, or maybe perhaps must do in accordance with Allah, with what Allah and His Messenger have said. But if we're talking about still religious, but non-Shari'i, then different metrics of assessment come to bear. Then we're looking at efficiency. We're looking at profitability. We're looking at aesthetics. All things that do not come from the Shari'i side.
Yes.
And the problem that many Muslims have had is that they have thought that this is guaranteed by this. I don't know if you can see my hands. I can't see them.
Yeah, I see them.
Well, but you understand what I mean by that?
Yes.
In other words, that as long as we are compliant, Shar'an, the policy is good. It may be a disastrous policy. It may be is it permissible for me to marry this woman? I give this example in the book because Qadhi gives the same example. Is it permissible for me to marry this woman? And, she's not related to me and she's not in Idda or any of those kinds of things. Shar'an, perfectly permissible. All right? Many Muslims sort of assume then if it's permissible for me to marry her, or him, then this person must be a good mate for me. But then there are other metrics that have to be brought to bear on those decision-making processes. And the Islamic Secular emphasizes the necessity of this metric of assessment as part of the religion.
Yes. So the point is that, permissibility is not the same as normativity, right?
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Even when the Islamic Secular is concerned with what you would call practical or prudential concerns, the end goal and ultimately though, the goal of the Islamic Secular is to make space for Muslims acting in the non-Shari'i realm based on non-Shari'i considerations to assist or contribute to the establishment of Islamic norms, right, or Islamic normativity. That's what I mean. So in that case, the Islamic Secular
are slightly different, but yes. But you see, when you say Islamic norms, though, I mean, the problem with that is that the tendency is to think of the Islamic in sort of universalist terms. The norms in Nigeria are not going to be the same as the norms in Indonesia, as we can see today. I was in one Arab country once, and I was chewing gum. A woman said to me, "Come on, you can't chew gum. You're a man. Can't chew gum in public." Okay, that's the norm. Is it haram to chew gum in public for a man? But again, I mean, no culture can survive without norms. And I think that this is one of the things that we've suffered from. We have assumed that we can have, Shari'i norms alone, and that will be enough to govern everything. But communities can't function like that. All right? Because they have likes and dislikes, preferences and non-preferences. And those things go into the kind of centripetal force that a culture will exercise over its members. Either that force draws them all in, or, you ignore all those preferences, you ignore all those likes and dislikes, and you end up with centrifugal force that tends to spin everything out.
Okay, so do you mind if we switch gears and talk about some of the thinkers that you engage with in the book? I know that you engage deeply with Wael Hallaq, Andrew March, Abdullah Naim, and Shahab Ahmad, among others. But these four thinkers in particular I mentioned because they seem, in my mind, to represent a theoretical turn in recent Islamic studies, right? And I don't know if you would agree with that, but I also think that in many ways they continue in an older tradition of what I sometimes call compatibilist inquiry, insofar as Islam is always the thing to be reconciled with some other dominant idea or framework. So first, I want to ask why you think questions about Islam in the works of these thinkers, among others, are sort of persistently framed around compatibility. For example, the compatibility of Sharia with the state, compatibility of democracy with the Khilafah, the compatibility of Islam's modernity with its pre-modernity. And then second, do you see this framing as limiting or necessary for advancing Islamic thought?
Wow. I'm a little I'm a little bit hesitant to answer it because I think that an honest answer would potentially imply certain indictments of other scholars that I do not mean to communicate. Let me go back to the first line of your question here. When you say theoretical turn and you ask if I agree with that or not, I'm not sure I can agree with it because I'm not sure I understand what you mean. What is that theoretical turn?
I think there's a lot of recent literature in Islamic studies, a lot of recent writing trying to theorize Islam as such. And in that regard, I mean, there's been something of a theoretical turn. And I think it's been particularly evident over the past decade.
Okay, so there's a lot of what I call in the book, a lot of Islamic studies 2.0. Obviously, I agree with that approach. That's why I'm glad I asked you what you meant by that. Because in a sense, I mean, my work has been not so much theorizing Islam, but certainly bringing Islam, as I understand it, as a transgenerational, to borrow the term of Asad, just a discursive tradition. I mean, into conversation and to bear upon the realities of confronting Muslims in the modern world. I mean, that's been a part of my work for quite some time, and not only on the level of things that sort of the macro level of things like the Islamic Secular. But even on the micro level, dealing with issues involving Islam in the Black American community. All right. So, I mean, that's been a part of my work for quite some time. Now, here's where it gets dicey. You asked why that is the case. And maybe what may be deemed to be the implicit indictment may be tempered somewhat by the fact that I would include myself among those scholars. So if I'm indicting them, I'm indicting me as well, all right? But I'm not really indicting because, as I said before, let me do it this way. The Indian scholar, Ashish Nandi, who I think I cite in the book, if I didn't cite him in this book, somewhere else, has what I consider to be a very powerful line. He says, defeat is a disaster. And it's a disaster because of the impact that it has on the souls of the vanquished, to the point that they internalize the mode of thinking and being in the world of the vanquisher, and then in turn end up in a position where they can only even resist the vanquisher on the vanquisher's own terms. And so, in order to establish the stature of Islam in the modern world, it has to appeal to the standards that have been set by the vanquisher, by the dominant civilization. All right? That dominant civilization privileges what? Reason privileges what? Democracy privileges what? The state, etc. Now, you might say that, well, yeah, that's that's unfortunate. That should be the case. But as I said before, you can ignore that dominant culture. I'm not sure that does anything to weaken it or to redirect it or to minimize its impact. So what I'm saying is that there is this huge, humongous civilizational interlocutor out there. And what scholars are doing is, I think, engaging that civilization in conversation. I think it makes a difference whether that civilization becomes a dictator or simply an interlocutor. And so that's why I think that some of the benchmarks you see Muslims constantly trying to compare Islam to, all right? That's why they're comparing them to. You don't hear anybody asking, well, how does Sharia, how does Islam relate to dharma? Well, how does Islam relate to the concept of the living dead in traditional African religion? That's not a comparison that's being made. It could be made, all right? But those happen not to be the dominant ascending civilizations. And what Muslims have to do, in some sense, is find ways of both appropriating and undermining the authority of many aspects of that civilization. And the hope, from my perspective at least, is that the means to do that is not by reading one's own civilization through that, but by somehow finding the means of getting back to one's own tradition and allowing it both to be read on its own terms and then to be articulated on its own terms. And that's what I'm attempting to do in the Islamic Secular. I mean, if you are fair to me, you'd have to acknowledge there's nothing in the West that approaches an Islamic Secular. It's not an attempt to align Islam with anything in the West. It's an attempt to articulate Islam on its own terms. Now, do we use language that's a part of the modern world? What other language are you going to use?
When you say there's nothing in the Western world approaching the Islamic Secular, you mean there's no analogous concept, or do you mean there's no, like, can we not locate something similar in Christian thought where, for example, somebody...
I mean, you could locate the concept of differentiation, but nobody's calling it a Christian secular and nobody's articulating it. And I don't think that they could in the same terms because they don't have a Sharia.
I wish we had enough time to jump into each and every one of those thinkers that I mentioned, Hallaq, March, Naim, and Ahmad. I don't think we will have enough time, unfortunately. Let's see. But I do want to at least ask you about Hallaq and something in particular you said about Hallaq. On page 195 of your book, and I'll quote here, you say, "One wonders if what Professor Hallaq is really describing in his work is not simply the impossible state, but the impossible religion." Do you unpack that a little bit and say what you meant by those words?
What I was saying was that essentially, Professor Hallaq argues that Sharia basically equals Islam, that Islam stands and falls on Sharia, and that it's impossible to establish a state based on Sharia in the modern world. All right? If Sharia cannot be established in the modern world, and Islam is equal to Sharia, all right, then by association, Islam cannot be established in the modern world. That was my critique of what Professor Hallaq put forward. If Islam is Sharia, and Sharia has no place in the modern world, then Islam has no place in the modern world.
There's a diametric opposition here between your position and his. These are effectively irreconcilable positions.
Again, the non-Shari'i is still Islam, and that's what I hope that everybody who reads this book comes away with. That the non-Shari'i is still Islam. It's simply not Shari'i, and all that's saying is that I'm assessing this investment strategy on the basis of whether it is efficient, whether it is profitable, whether it is sustainable. All right? I've already determined the Shari'i status of that investment strategy. So that's done. The problem that we have is that if Shari'i assessments are the only assessments that we can make as Muslims, then what kind of quality control do we have over our investments?
Right. Yeah.
And how? Where does that leave us? You're on the stage, the world stage of civilizations. Whether you want to or not, there is a competition.
So that then is your disagreement with Hallaq. March and Naim also deal with the state. What's your disagreement with their approaches?
Well, again, I mean, let me just preface this by saying, and this goes back even to Professor Hallaq, I was not trying to attack their theses and disprove their theses, and I hope that came through in the book. I'm not attacking them. All I'm saying is that if we consider the Islamic secular as a bona fide articulation of Islam, then these theses have to change. Because what Hallaq is saying, as I said, Sharia equals Islam equals Sharia. Sharia has no place. Islam has no place. But what about all the Islamic secular dimensions of Islam? All right, that's one. What's his name? Naim is arguing for a secular state. All right, and what does he mean by secular? All right, I mean, so many. We just had an election in this country, did we not? Let's just take. Don't worry, we're not going to get political. Let's just take. What were the major issues that they were saying were going to determine, who was going to win? What were the major issues?
Same ones that usually come up every election cycle.
Which are
immigration.
What else?
Abortion, healthcare, the economy.
Immigration, healthcare, the economy, abortion. All right, let's take those 4. One of those is Sharia, which is what? Abortion. I mean, can you have an abortion or can you not? That's a question that Sharia contemplates, all right? And you have the schools of law who give their answers, okay? What does Sharia have to say about a healthcare plan? What does it have to say about an immigration policy? You follow what I mean by that?
Yeah.
But when he says we need a secular state, for what? To deal with immigration? We could deal with immigration with an Islamic state on the basis of non-Shari'i reason and still be perfectly Islamic. We could devise a healthcare policy on the basis of non-Shari'i deliberation and still be perfectly Islamic. So why do we need a secular state along the lines that Naeem describes in order to be able to function in the modern world? That's my thesis there. And again, if the Islamic secular had been taken as part of the discourse, I think these theses would have come to slightly different conclusions. That's my point. So my argument is that we need to now integrate the Islamic secular into these discourses about the modern state.
Here's a question in response to your point about Naeem. So the Islamic secular as an alternative model, as one that you say can accommodate what Naeem thinks the Western secular state is required for.
No, let me clarify something.
Sure.
I'm not saying that the Islamic secular completely replaces the kind of state that Naeem wants. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if you're talking about a modern state, all right, because part of Naeem's problem is with Sharia. He's saying that Sharia cannot be a part of the modern state, all right? And that's what he means by a secular state, okay? All right? Now, what I'm saying is that, okay, myself and Professor Naeem, okay, we will disagree on that point. And let's just set that disagreement aside. But beyond the law of Sharia, okay, you have issues of healthcare. You have issues of immigration. You have issues of gun control, etc., etc. All right? Why do you need to separate Sharia from the state in order to be able to deal with these issues effectively? That's my point.
Okay. Let me just jump into this question then. Now that that's clear, what's to prevent the Islamic secular from, in some capacity, reflecting or reproducing certain features or elements of the Western secular? So, for example, modern capitalism. We say, does the Sharia say anything about healthcare? Does the Sharia say anything about, traffic policy? And the answer, as was intimated earlier, is no. But again, does the Sharia say anything about capitalism? One might say as well, no. And with your claims earlier about intention and community as regulating factors in the production or regulation of what we might call the Islamic secular, someone might say Western forms of capitalism may be reproduced under the umbrella of the Islamic secular.
Okay, let me make something clear here. Make myself a little bit unpopular, right? I think it is a categorical mistake to set up this Islam-West dichotomy. That there is this mutual exclusivity between Islam and the West. If you end up with quote-unquote Western elements in Islam, then there are two criteria. One is a Shari'i criterion. Is this permissible according to Sharia or not? If it is, on one level, who cares where it came from? We can have Western elements in Islam, but we could have pagan Arabian elements in Islam. All right? That's on the one hand. The second thing is, okay, this Western element comes. It's deemed permissible, Sharan. Then the question becomes, what utility does it have for us? Should we adopt it? And that's an Islamic secular deliberation. So whether Islam ends up with this or that element of capitalism, and by the way, I think capitalism is a Sharia issue, but that's we'll just take your perspective on that. But whether Islam ends up with this or that element of capitalism or Western civilization, all right, will depend on a combination of Shari deliberations in terms of can we, and then non-Shari deliberations in terms of should we. All right? Now, after that, I'm not all that concerned with one exception, and it's in the book as well. I do think, and this goes back to something that you've been alluding to a lot, I think, Riyadh, I do think that we have to just get real about the fact that one of the things from which Muslims and others suffer from in the modern world is a complete lack of cultural and intellectual authority, as a function of which they routinely fall under the cultural authority of the dominant civilization. And once that happens, that cultural authority does all their thinking for them. In other words, in the West, this thing is culturally valued. Before we even start thinking about it in terms of should we, the fact that it's culturally valued in the West overtakes our thinking, and we take it on. In that context, there may be things that are perfectly permissible coming from the West, but that threaten to reduce us to more cultural or intellectual subservience to the West, on the basis of which perhaps we should reject it. But again, that to me is an Islamic secular deliberation. I don't have to say it's haram to reject it. Let me give you one example, and I'll get in some trouble for this, but manish. I used to go through this with my children. I was of the opinion, and still am, the Halloween, it's not haram. We have to get into all the details. And yet, I did not permit my children to go trick-or-treat. And they would, but Dad, you said it's not haram. Yeah, it's not haram. Then how come we can't go? And again, because I can explain to them in these terms, but I don't want you falling under the cultural authority, all right, out there, okay, which today is just Halloween, but which tomorrow may sweep you up in a torrent, okay, of cultural non-thinking. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
All right. So I'm doing a non-Shari Islamic secular deliberation, all right, in terms of not as what is permissible, but what may be good or bad for you. And not everything that's permissible is good for you.
I want to say, just before I move on to the point you made earlier about the distinction between the West and the non-West, or the West and Islam being sort of untenable, I completely agree with that. I think that there's a porousness between these concepts now that makes it difficult to sustain a sort of hard and fast distinction between these two categories.
Not just now, always.
Always.
Student of mine is writing a dissertation, and one of the points that he makes in his dissertation is that, you know, we've gotten too used to thinking of Islam as a civilization in terms of its relationship to others, all right, as one of a number of billiard balls, all right? They just smash into each other on the table, bounce off of each other, where their constitution is completely unmodified. This is just nonsense, all right? Islam has always been porous, has always been affected by others, has always affected others. Whether or not that effect has been permissible or not, that's a Shari'i question that the jurists have deliberated over. Whether it was good or not, these are Islamic secular deliberations, some of which are still in the process of deliberating today. But I'll say that one sort of intellectual fallacy that I think that we sometimes fall into is that, this notion, we don't like capitalism. We don't like, a communism. We have our issues with Christianity. All right. Fine. But we cannot imagine that getting rid of Christianity, getting rid of capitalism, getting rid of communism equals Islam. It just means you got rid of communism. You got rid of capitalism. It does not mean that you've instantiated Islam. You got rid of Christianity. It does not mean you've instantiated Islam. And this goes back to your earlier point, Leon. I think that this obsession with the West keeps us in that mode of thinking. What is Islam? Right? We're more into what is Islam? What's not Islam? It's not Christianity. It's not capitalism. It's not communism. All right? And then we fall into the fallacy. So if we get rid of those, we have Islam.
Just to clarify, when something is determined to be Islamic under the rubric of the Islamic secular, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the good or the right decision to make. It can be the wrong decision to make, but still Islamic under the rubric of the Islamic secular, or maybe rather a harmful or undesirable decision. Right?
Yes, because we might be wrong in our deliberations. All right.
So in this case, you do not attach good and right to Islamic in the sense of Islamic secular.
No, we hope it's good and right. That's why we're doing it. All right. But we're not infallible. We're not masoom. The only way we could this is right would be that we have some shari'i dalil for that. We don't. And so we may come up with an economic policy, and this has happened in Muslim countries. I mean, with in all good faith, nobody's selling out, nobody's doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. They honestly, try to come up with, the 5-year plan that's going to work, and it doesn't work.
Right. So Professor, you've established very well that the Islamic secular and considerations that fall under the rubric of the Islamic secular, again, not necessarily concerned with permissibility or morality or any such thing, right? Simply,
any such thing. I mean, morality is always there because the gaze of the God of Islam is always there.
Yes, sure.
But morality is not the only thing that's there.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean,
Sure.
just look at the world today. I mean, it would be nice, okay, if those Muslims who are suffering and the bombs falling on them right now had some surface-to-air missiles. That's Islamic secular. Sharia is not going to produce those missiles.
Yeah. And it's Islamic secular because I think you put it this way several times in the book. It's contributing, or it's helping to contribute to an overall nomos or possibility structure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my question is, if there's an act or an idea that is not doing that, that again is permissible according to the Sharia, but it's not contributing to the nomos or the possibility structure, like, a Muslim playing a video game in his bedroom.
I got you.
Right? Yeah. Where would you locate that? Where would you locate that? Yeah.
What do you mean where I locate it?
Like, would you still say that can be considered an Islamic act?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is what I've tried to get into in the book, and your question is one for which I don't have what I would consider to be a fully effective answer. And the reason for that is that those answers come out on the ground, right? Because these are things that have to be negotiated on the ground. Let's say we establish the norm and we say, go back to this, the sort of trite example that I gave earlier, between spicy and non-spicy food. And we say, yeah, we want to have spicy. I mean, most of these people here love spicy food. We're going to have spicy. All right. And I say, no, we don't, I don't want to have spicy. All right. I mean, on the one hand, I could not say that my dissent is haram. But again, I do think that if we're thinking in terms of the effective instantiation of Islam communally on the ground, then my point of view could be marginalized in the interest of the collective. Remember what I said before, that collectives have to be effectively managed because they can become autocratic and problematic in all kinds of ways. All right? And yet we all we value our individual identity, but we also value our collective identity. So there is this dialectical relationship between our individuality and our broader belonging to a collective, whatever that might be.
Yeah. And, if I can ask you, I'm going to read you a quote here from the book, which struck me as interesting. When you were discussing Abu Nuwas, broadly, the Arab poet, and you mentioned that how, despite the, let's say, controversial content of much of his poetry.
That's putting it lightly. Mm-hmm.
Yes. No less than Sufyan al-Thawri, praised him as the most poetic of people.
Yeah, that's going
and,
to
yeah. And the way you phrase it is that, quote, while al-Thawri would obviously not approve of all of Abu Nuwas's work, he almost certainly appreciated its contribution to the linguistic sensibilities of the Muslims, as well as to the development of a Muslim aesthetic, Muslim cultural literacy, and Muslim cultural self-reliance, with all that this implies for the plausibility structure of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was curious about this, which is, what if his poetry did not do any of those things?
Then what value would it have then?
So then in your view, then there's no reason to bring that into the fold, if you will, of the Islamic.
Wait a minute. Forget Islamic. If Abu Nuwas's poetry didn't appeal to anybody, we wouldn't know who Abu Nuwas was.
Of course, well,
there were
yes.
poets in his time who just didn't make the cut. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. Maybe.
No. That's more or less it. I mean, this is what I was trying to understand with the question about the Islamic Secular and its relationship with norms.
Yeah.
Right. And
one of the things that I'm trying to establish in this book, and I think that if we just reflect on our reality, all right, I don't think that Muslims, quite frankly, and I'm using religion here in the standard Western sense, all right, not Islamic Secular. Just bear with me. I don't think that most Muslims feel sort of religiously overwhelmed in the world. That Christian theology we just can't. Oh my God, it's just so it just overwhelms us. All right, and we just can't find our footing in the face of this Christian theology. Or we can't find our footing in the face of this Jewish theology. But culturally speaking, intellectually speaking, that's where Muslims feel the most overwhelmed. And that's where we're dealing with issues of cultural production, technology development, plausibility structure. And these, again, are predominantly Islamic secular, non-Shari'i endeavors.
All right. And on the question of plausibility structure, which is an important concept for you, in your view, is the ultimate goal of an Islamic plausibility structure, whatever that looks like in whatever context, is the goal to cultivate a kind of embodied religiosity, such that Islam, as both an orientation and a practice, transcends or comes to transcend the thinkable? As in, it's not necessarily a question of, conscious assent or intention, but it just becomes almost like an automatic mode of being in the world. Is that, in your mind, sort of the end game of the plausibility structure?
Yes, with qualifications, because yes, and this for me is a big yes. All right, because most people on a daily basis do not encounter religion through the books of scholars or even the Quran and Sunnah. Let's just be honest and blunt about that. They encounter it through the carrier culture of Islam. All right? And part of what has happened is that carrier culture, all right, has been denigrated, has been weakened. And therefore, the ability for people to feel Islam, in a sense, on a daily basis has also weakened. All right? Plausibility structure enables people then to see the truth and reality of Islam as just normal. I don't have to think about whether it's cold outside or it's hot outside. When I go outside, I know cold, hot. All right? That's what plausibility structure does. At the same time, however, plausibility structure, taken too far, can result in a sort of cultural Islam that loses its capacity to domesticate it, to domesticate its own impulses. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it lacks any higher authority on the basis of which it can judge itself. It becomes its own self-authenticating judge. So plausibility structure is important, but it too must ultimately be managed.
And the source of that management, in your mind, is?
It's a combination. I mean, probably primarily Shari'i. But you see, even when you have the Shari'i, I mean, let's take something like dawah. You would think that dawah is almost a 100% Shari'i endeavor because you're trying to convey to people basically what Allah and His Messenger have said. And yet, the mode of communication is going to have to be deliberated on the basis of considerations that are not necessarily, all right, coming from Quran and Sunnah. If this makes sense to you. I mean, you're not going to get dawah to everybody in the same way.
Yeah.
You're going to adjust that based on your consideration of, who they are, where they are, what their background is. I mean, how they're likely to see you, etc., and all kinds of other things. All kinds of calculations, Islamic secular, non-Shari'i calculations that you have to make in order to be effective even in dawah.
And to what extent do you think that the plausibility structure can be established and maintained outside of, say, the apparatus of the state or just any sort of political power?
Wow. I know we got to go now. This is a big issue, and let me try to say something here that may assist you in understanding part of my perspective. For me, what appears to be the case oftentimes is that when Muslims in an academic setting or in a quasi-academic setting like this, when we think about the state, we tend to think about Europe. Now, I happen to be a member of a broader community. I'm talking about the Black American community. I'm not talking about Muslims, the Black American community, who many theorists have identified even as a sort of a counter-public. The state has never been able to determine that culture in the ways that we tend to assume that states determine culture. So my sense of this, I don't have the same sense of the state as being as almighty, all right, as some others may think it is. I mean, you're talking about a community that changed the state's language. I mean, I'd say the state, I mean, the dominant cultures. I mean, they influenced the language. They influenced the cuisine. They influenced the music. And all of this, despite the fact, they were living in a very powerful state. So I think that community, and by the way, this is one of the functions of communities, so to push back on the state, as the home of their own identity formation. Communities like to form their own identities, all right, and not be defined by the state, all right. I think that I tend to think that's much more possible coming out of a Black experience than many others think it is. I think, thinking in terms of Europe.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time. But thank you very much, Professor Jackson, for joining us for this conversation. It was, for me at least, very enjoyable and very stimulating.
Yeah, likewise.
For me as well. Thank you very much.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Please do share your feedback and recommendations and do support the podcast. Whether you're tuning in on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd appreciate a 5-star review or a like. And if you're inclined, leave us a comment too. This helps spread the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org/Protean-View and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive behind-the-scenes content in the future. Until next time.